There is a particular cruelty built into the music industry. It hands you the Sun chart positions, radio plays, sold-out shows, then watches without blinking as it burns you down. Some artists spent decades chasing what they glimpsed for 30 seconds. Most never found it again. And the ones who came closest? They got one shot, one song, one moment when the whole world stopped and listened. Then silence. What follows are 10 of those moments, 10 songs that detonated, 10 artists who never quite recovered. Not tragedies, exactly. But not victories either. Something rawer than both. No. Dici Sugar Sugar the Archies, 1969. Ron Dante recorded the vocals in a single afternoon. He was not famous. He would not become famous. His face never appeared on an album cover, never stared out from a poster on a teenager's wall, because the band he sang for did not exist. The Archies were drawings, ink on paper, characters pulled from a Saturday morning cartoon and dressed up in pop music clothing. Don Kirshner, the man behind the curtain, understood something cold and practical about pop music in 1969. Real bands had opinions. Real bands fought with producers, demanded creative control, walked out of sessions. Animated bands did not. So he assembled a team. Dante on lead vocals, Tony Wine on backing harmonies, session musicians filling the gaps. The result was constructed, calculated, precision-engineered for radio. It was, by every critical standard of the era, not supposed to matter. It mattered enormously. Sugar Sugar parked itself at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 for 4 consecutive weeks and became the single best-selling record of the entire year, 1969. Tom Jones covered it. Tina Turner covered it. A cartoon outsold every living, breathing band in America. The music press winced. The public did not care. It locked into something pure and uncomplicated that no amount of sophistication could replicate. Their follow-up, Jingle Jangle, evaporated on contact. The Archies vanished, which was easy, since they had never truly existed. Dante went back to session work, invisible again by design. What remains is this: one song, one year, one permanent place in the DNA of a generation that never asked whether it was real. It was real enough. No. 9. Wipe out the Surfaris, 1963. They needed a B-side. That was the entire ambition. 4 California teenagers had recorded Surfer Joe, needed something to fill the other side of the vinyl, and had approximately nothing prepared. So drummer Ron Wilson launched into a solo. Wild, reckless, completely unplanned. Someone grabbed a surfboard and cracked it in front of the microphone for the sound effect. Someone else leaned into the mic and shouted a word that stuck. The song got its name from that shout. The whole thing took minutes. That frantic drum break tore through American radio in the summer of 1963 and climbed to #2 on the Billboard chart. It did not reach #1 only because Fingertips by the 1-2-year-old Stevie Wonder was immovable that summer. But it got all of America moving teenagers in landlocked states who had never seen a wave in their lives suddenly understood, viscerally, what surfing felt like. The drums did that, not the lyrics. The drums. The Surfaris never cracked the top 40 again. They broke up a few years later, scattered back to ordinary lives. But Wipeout kept moving without them through the decades, through film soundtracks, through every montage that ever needed to evoke summer and speed, and the specific recklessness of being 17. The band dissolved. The song refused to. No. 8 Spirit in the Sky. Norman Greenbaum. 1969. Norman Greenbaum wrote the lyrics in 15 minutes. He was watching a country singer perform a Christian hymn on television, reached for a pen, and filled a page before the program ended. He was not a religious man. He was not a country musician. He was a bearded, Jewish Californian with a fondness for fuzz guitar. And what poured out of him that evening was one of the strangest, most unlikely cocktails in rock history. Gospel fire wrapped in distortion, backed by female voices that sounded pulled from a southern church service, topped with a guitar riff that sounded like the earth itself shifting underfoot. Spirit in the Sky dropped in December of 1969 and detonated through 1,970. It reached #1 in multiple countries, sold millions of copies, and bought Greenbaum decades of royalty income from a single afternoon's work. Radio programmers did not quite know what category to file it under. Rock? Gospel? Boogie? It answered to none of those labels, and all of them simultaneously. That was the source of its power. His next single was called Canned Ham. It went nowhere. By 1972, no record deal remained, no clear direction forward. Greenbaum walked away from the industry and went to work as a cook in California. One song, one run, one exit. Was it enough? He seemed to think so. Whether the music industry agreed was never really the point. No. 7 Eve of Destruction, Barry McGuire, 1965. P. F. Sloan wrote the lyrics in a single furious sitting in 1964. He was watching television Vietnam footage, civil rights marches, nuclear drills, and the words came out of him not as poetry, but as accusation. Raw, grinding, without mercy. Barry McGuire, a former member of the New Christy Minstrels, took the demo into the studio and recorded it in one take, still holding the lyric sheet. The vocal was supposed to be a rough guide track. They used it as the final. McGuire's voice did not sing the words so much as grind them out gravel and broken glass. The production was sparse, almost brutal. No strings, no sweetening, no studio gloss. Just a man and a microphone telling 1,965 America exactly what it was. A country sending its poorest young men to die in a jungle while preaching freedom at home. Radio programmers who played it risked angry phone calls. Radio programmers who didn't play it risked looking like they were hiding something. Some stations banned it outright, calling it defeatist, un-American, dangerous to public morale. A handful of artists rushed out patriotic counter-songs designed to drown it out. None of them reached what McGuire reached that summer, the top of the Billboard chart, the first protest song ever to sit at #1. His voice scraped the air like a blade that day, aimed at every comfortable assumption the decade had built around itself. The bridge laid it bare, no metaphor, no poetry, just the arithmetic of injustice spoken aloud. The phrase landed like a verdict, not a warning, a conclusion. McGuire wasn't predicting the future. He was reading from the present tense, and the line that followed that chorus was the one that drew blood, the one that made radio programmers sweat and military recruiters furious, the one that said, without softening a single syllable, what an entire generation already knew. 7 words, a complete argument, the entire contradiction of American civic life in 1965, compressed into a single breath. Nobody could unhear it once they had heard it. That was the point. But McGuire never found that altitude again. No other top 40 entry, no second anthem. He carried Eve of Destruction through the rest of his career like a monument he could not move out of his own shadow. The song was too big, too specific, too rooted in one precise, volcanic moment in American history to belong to any other time, which made it permanent in a way sequels never are. No, it doesn't. That line still hangs in the air, decades later, in a country still arguing the same arguments. McGuire didn't solve anything. He just refused to pretend it wasn't happening. No. 6 inches the year 25. 25 Zager, and Evans 1,969. Rick Evans wrote the song in 1,964 inches, a rented room in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was 20 years old, broke, and not yet in a band. He wrote it in a single long session and then put it in a drawer, where it sat for 3 years. When he finally recorded it with Denny Zager on a local label, they pressed 500 copies and sold them out of the back of a car. It cost them a few $100s to make. It would eventually sell millions. In the summer of 1969, as Apollo 11 carried 3 Americans toward the moon, and the entire planet watched the sky with something between awe and vertigo, in the year 25 rose to the top of the American charts. The timing was surgical. The song asked what humanity might become if it kept chasing progress without ever questioning the price a dark, spiraling vision of a future where technology had swallowed the soul and humanity had sleepwalked into its own erasure. On the week Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, this song sat at #1. America was looking up. The song was looking further ahead and not liking what it saw. The duo spent 6 weeks at the top of the chart in the United States alone and swept across half the world. Their follow-up, Mr. Turnkey, was a song about a rapist pleading for his own imprisonment, too dark, too strange, too confrontational, even for the audience that had embraced an apocalyptic prophecy. It sank without noise. By 1971, Zager and Evans had dissolved. Evans went back to Nebraska. The future they had imagined kept arriving, year by year, decade by decade. Nobody called them back to ask if they'd been right. No, 5-9, 6 tears, ? And the Mysterians, 1,966. He changed his name legally to a punctuation mark, not as a stunt, not as marketing, as identity. The man known only as ? led a group of young Mexican-American musicians out of a Michigan basement in 1966 and toward something nobody in the industry had prepared for. A #1 record that sounded like it had been recorded in a garage, because it essentially had been. The song started life as Too Many Teardrops. Somewhere in rehearsals, the title shifted, the Farfisa organ locked into a hypnotic loop, and the thing became 96. Tears raw, repetitive, relentless, and completely irresistible. Released on a local label in Saginaw, Michigan, its regional momentum built so fast and so wide that a major label came calling. By October of 1966, it sat at the top of the Billboard Hot 100. A group of working-class Latino teenagers from the industrial Midwest had just done what the British invasion had spent years consolidating as its exclusive territory. Music critics argued about what exactly 96 Tears was. Garage rock, proto-punk, an early blueprint for what would become new wave. The labels came later, after the dust settled. In the moment, it was simply a sound nobody had heard before. Too minimal, too weird, too honest for the polished pop of 1,966, and utterly unstoppable because of it. The group pushed back, but the industry did not follow. None of their other records came close. ? Stepped away. The song stayed loud. Ono shtiri black is black, Los Bravos, Tisiktevic toshes desiaches. The year was 1966. The song was recorded in London. The band was Spanish. Those 3 facts, placed side by side, tell you everything about what Los Bravos understood that most of their contemporaries did not. That the British invasion had redrawn the map of popular music, and if you wanted to compete on that new map, you had to play by its rules, including singing in English and recording in the city that had become the center of the world's sound. They were formed across 2 cities, Madrid and London, a hybrid act with 1 foot on each continent. Keyboardist Manuel Fernandez, guitarist Miguel Vicens, drummer Pablo Sanllehi, bassist Juan Sala, and at the front Mike Kennedy, born Antonio Martinez, with a voice that carried enough weight and soul to hold its own against any English frontman working that year. Recorded with session musicians and produced by Ivo Raimonde, Black is Black was built to travel. It did. The chorus was disarmingly direct. No metaphor, no ornamentation, just a declaration of loss, repeated with enough conviction to hollow you out. I want my baby back. The line hit like a fist, simple, precise, unapologetic. It did not ask for sympathy, it demanded witness. The record tore through the charts. #4 in the United States, #2 in the United Kingdom, #1 in Canada. More than 2 million copies sold in Spain alone. It was the first time a Spanish band had cracked the English-speaking world at that level, and they had done it not by hiding their roots, but by channeling them through the one universal language the 1960s had invented. Distorted guitar, and a chorus that lodges in the brain and refuses to leave. Heard again, the repetition is the point. Grief does not come once and leave cleanly. It circles, it returns. Kennedy understood that instinctively. In 1968, tragedy dismantled what success had built. Keyboardist Manolo Fernandez lost his wife in an accident. He took his own life shortly after, leaving a note. The band could not recover from the weight of that. Mike Kennedy continued as a solo artist. Los Bravos said their goodbyes. For once, the music industry's cold machinery of forgotten careers felt beside the point. Some losses are simply losses, with nothing left to explain. No. 3 Green Tambourine, The Lemon Pipers, 1967. 5 college students from Oxford, Ohio, signed a record contract in 1967 and immediately discovered they had signed away their right to record the music they actually wanted to make. They admired Jefferson Airplane. They played long psychedelic sets in local bars. They wanted to be taken seriously, wanted to be experimental, wanted to earn the respect of their peers in a moment when rock music was reaching for something genuinely new. Buddha Records had a different idea. The label's instruction was unambiguous: record Green Tambourine or record nothing. The song had been written by producer Paul Lecca and lyricist Shelley Pins, professional pop craftsmen who had engineered the bubblegum formula to its sharpest point. Electric sitters, floating strings, a melody clean enough to whistle on first listen. The Lemon Pipers hated it. They recorded it anyway, because the alternative was obscurity. Released in November of 1967, it climbed through the winter and reached #1 in the United States in February of 1968, selling more than 1 million copies. At its peak, the Lemon Pipers were sitting above the Beatles and the Rolling Stones on the American charts. That fact, absurd and humiliating and genuinely surreal, contains the entire paradox of their career. Their moment of greatest commercial power was also the moment they felt most like captives. The melody they resented floated through radios across America, warm and inviting, and deceptively simple. My green tambourine. 3 words, a street musician's pitch, distilled to its barest form. The Lemon Pipers wanted to build cathedrals. Buddha Records gave them a tambourine and told them to smile. Follow-ups like Rice is Nice and Jelly Jungle followed the same formula and produced diminishing returns, not enough to matter, too much to ignore. The band grew exhausted, performing songs that felt borrowed from someone else's artistic vision. By 1969, they dissolved. Their story is not one of failure. It is something more specific than that. A story of artists handed exactly the success they did not want, then watching it vanish before they could find a way to trade it for something they could live with. No. To San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair. Scott McKenzie, 1967. John Phillips wrote it in 20 minutes. He was not trying to capture a generation. He was writing an advertisement, a musical invitation to the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 1967. Something to draw young people toward California, something to set the right mood before the show even started. It was a functional piece of promotional writing. And then Scott McKenzie opened his mouth, and something else happened entirely. Mackenzie's voice was not aggressive, not challenging, not political in the conventional sense. It was patient, gentle. It settled over you like an open hand rather than a closed fist. Against the backdrop of 1967 Vietnam, draft cards burning, cities in flames, a government that had stopped pretending to listen, that gentleness was its own form of confrontation. It said, "There is another way to exist. Come and see." Thousands of young Americans heard that invitation and took it literally. They packed cars and buses and hitchhiked across the country toward San Francisco, wearing flowers, carrying the song in their heads like a compass. The Summer of Love did not begin with politicians or manifestos. It began with this. The voice offered no argument, no rhetoric, no anger, just a direction and a symbol, and it was somehow more powerful than any of the rage. The song reached #4 in the United States and #1 in the United Kingdom, Germany, Ireland, and New Zealand. It sold more than 7 million copies worldwide. Phillips had written it in the same time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. Mackenzie had recorded it in a matter of hours. The Summer of Love built itself, in part, around 20 minutes of work, and a melody that asked nothing of you, except that you believe, just for the length of a song, that something better was possible. Mackenzie never found another hit. His label reissued older material, he recorded a few more singles, and none of it caught the same current. His voice became inseparable from one specific summer, one specific idea, one specific and unrepeatable moment in history, which meant he was, in a sense, permanent and also frozen. A man defined forever by a song about somewhere else. No, 1 inch Agata Davida, Iron Butterfly, 1968. The title was a mistake. Doug Ingle, Iron Butterfly's keyboardist, had been drinking when he slurred "In the Garden of Eden" so badly that his bandmates wrote down what they heard instead of what he meant. Nobody corrected it. The title stuck. And so, one of the most consequential pieces of music in rock history carries, at its core, an accident which might be the most honest thing about it. The song lasted 17 minutes. It filled an entire side of an LP. In 1968, that was not simply ambitious, it was a provocation. Radio could not play it. Singles charts could not accommodate it. The entire infrastructure of the music industry in 1968 was built around 3-minute songs, and Iron Butterfly had just handed it something that refused to fit. The album version was not made for radio, it was made for a room full of people with their eyes closed, surrendering to the weight of it. What Ingle and guitarist Eric Brann and drummer Ron Bushy had constructed was less a song than a ritual, a repetitive bass riff that hypnotized, organ lines that swelled and retreated like breath, guitar fuzz that pressed down on the chest, and at its center, one of the longest, most physically demanding drum solos in rock history. Bushy played for several minutes without stopping. The audience did not move, they could not. The experience they built tore through every boundary the industry thought it had drawn. Minimal lyrics, maximum presence, something that reached down into the body rather than the mind, and shook what it found there. And I walk this line. 4 words, barely a lyric, nearly a whisper against the enormity of the instrumentation surrounding it. But in that gap between silence and sound, something opened up a space large enough to hold everything the decade had been building toward. The abbreviated single reached the top 30. But the real reckoning came from the album itself, which sold more than 4 million copies in the United States, became one of the best-selling records of 1969, and remained on the charts for 140 weeks. Not months, weeks. Iron Butterfly's record outlasted trends, outlasted critical dismissal, outlasted the bands that were supposed to be more important. It simply would not stop. And at the core of it, almost swallowed by the noise, the declaration returned simple, physical, irreducible. In a God of feet. Not a metaphor, not a manifesto, just a man and a feeling and a band playing behind him like the end of the world sounded like this. That was enough. That was, it turned out, more than enough. By 1971, internal fractures had done what the charts could not. Eric Brann left. Ingle followed. The band collapsed under the weight of changes it could not sustain. But what they had left behind did not collapse with them. In Agata Davida planted seeds in every genre that followed. Hard rock, heavy metal, progressive rock all grew from roots this song exposed. The musicians scattered. The sound remained. 10 songs, 10 moments of pure, unrepeatable heat. The artists who made them were not always the most talented musicians of the 1960s, not always the most experienced, not always the most prepared. Some were teenagers, some were cartoons, some were accidents waiting to be discovered. What they all shared was this: a single intersection of the right idea, the right moment, and an audience ready to receive it. When that intersection happened, it happened completely. When it passed for good. The 1960s did not reward consistency. They rewarded collision, the violent, brief, blinding collision of a sound with a cultural moment so precise that the two could never be separated again. These 10 songs are not nostalgia. They are evidence. Evidence that one moment of perfect alignment between an artist and the world that surrounds them can outlast careers, outlast decades, outlast the artists themselves. The songs remain. Everything else recedes. The 1970s came next, and they brought their own collisions, their own single moments of ignition. But that is another story.